Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of this week's material in media. The last video examined the functionalist perspective in particular and how there's different functions and dysfunctions of media. So examining how it's an agent of socialization, how our social norms are kind of more enforced as we kind of consume different aspects of media, and that consumption too. Consumption can, at least for me, in my particular opinion, consumption can be viewed as a function, but also a dysfunction of media. And one major dysfunction is that numbness or that narcotizing effect that we feel. Today, we'll be examining the conflict perspective of how they view media. Now, if you remember with our conflict theorists, they're all about that division and inequality. So examining those two factors really and seeing how those are affecting us in our society. So when we put that spin and examining media in particular, they're really examining how exactly does mass media and social media and media in general create these divisions among us. And I really think that within this past year, we can really kind of see how the media has pitted us against each other, whether it's because of the Black Lives Matter movement, whether it's politically with all the political things that have been going on during this crazy year, or thinking about the pandemic and the access of even just the internet in general. Kind of thinking about that. That's what really conflict theorists are interested in. And thinking back to a couple of chapters ago and thinking of how our realities are constructed, Mills, C. Wright Mills, we kind of talked about him a little bit, and thinking about how media can really control what's being presented to us. And this kind of leads to this concept which is called gatekeeping. And what gatekeeping is just the pathways that media goes through in order to get to us, the consumer. So media has to basically travel through different gates and or checkpoints, depending on who you're talking to, before reaching us, the public, or us, the consumer. So what different pathways are there in order to really get at the consumer? What types of restrictions are put on things? And these different checkpoints or different gates can either be implemented because of a company and what they're in control, or depending on the country that you're living with. So say like China or North Korea, those governments are very, very strict as to what information their citizens are consuming. So that's one form of gatekeeping as well. It doesn't just have to be the company, it can also be governmental too. And gatekeeping isn't something that's totally new either. The term was first formally coined back in the 1940s to examine, or just to give a name to, how small town newspapers were really kind of focusing on certain events while ignoring others. And kind of thinking about this too, that really demonstrates the power that media has over giving information out, right? They're only focusing on this. The general public doesn't necessarily know what this big issue is. Or vice versa, they could be focusing on this big issue and not focusing on this little one that could turn into a big issue later on. So that really demonstrates the control that newspapers, as well as just media in general, has on the public. And thinking about TV networks, for instance, even though this graphic is a little bit old, 6 companies back in 2011 when this was created were basically the only thing that these 6 companies, the 6 things that were really in charge of formulating what was being shown on TV or just on the TV networks. Over time, buyouts have occurred, so Comcast and GE have changed. Disney has just grown more and more and more controlling, so to speak, as they're buying more and more things. Thinking about their acquisition of Marvel. I know they have like National Geographic. If you go on Disney Plus, for instance, all those different aspects that you can get nowadays. It's just not Disney anymore. Um, and Time Warner's kind of influence, I think, has changed a little bit as well. But you can really just see how dominant in our thing and how much control these different companies have on what resources and what they're producing, that kind of gets kicked back down to us. And thinking about it too, the different types of media, it doesn't necessarily have to be, newspapers and what they print out. It doesn't have to be academic journals even and what they publish, or TV stations. It can also be music as well. So gatekeeping can occur via music because if you have a song, say, you want to have your song play on the specific radio station, the radio station can deny that song just because it doesn't fit in with the radio station's label or the type of music that they have. So if you really wanted to become a next hit song person, you have to kind of be considerate about what type of targeted audience that they're having. And the audience is a very important thing that we're going to be discussing when we get to interaction for that. But in thinking about the internet and how the internet is kept, I guess, it's one of the least dominant forms of gatekeeping there is, just because of the amount of free-flowing information and how quickly information can get out. You can basically send any message that you want to pretty quickly and it'll be received. You can post basically anything. However, thinking back about the different governments and their control too, there's a lot of different laws that regulate things, right? Thinking about gambling or pornography, some politics even too. If you post something, all of a sudden you disappear in some countries because you posted that on social media. So you have to be kind of really considerate about that. When the Hong Kong protests were occurring, is that in 2020 or not 2019? I don't even know anymore. Thinking about that on Reddit was one of the major websites that information was kind of published on. And a lot of the posts were like, I don't know when I'm going to be able to post next, but this is what's occurring. Please make sure that my story is being kind of continued. So demonstrating just how much of a hold the government has on the information that's being kind of seeped out. And we can kind of see this too, thinking about the government's control, thinking about coronavirus as well. Especially in the beginning, we didn't really know much about it, just that it was in China, and China wasn't really giving us any information too. So, and that's because China is one of the more most gate-kept countries in the world regarding the information that's kind of given out just due to their government. So that's one aspect of gatekeeping. Okay, made it through that slide. Did it about 4 times because I got lots of errors and different uploads and things like that, so I was being gate kept from uploading it. But another aspect that conflict theorists examine is something that's called media monitoring. So basically that's just the monitoring of media content. So basically what the term is. There's different types of monitoring that occur. For instance, I keep talking about the government, but parental monitoring can be something as well. This graphic over here on the left is from the Pew Research Center, which is one of the most reputable research organizations that's out there. In future lectures in a couple of weeks here, I'll be using them quite a lot, talking about statistics and things like that, the more we get into our research project stuff. But with this one, the surveys that they sent out were sent back in 2014, 2015, and then this was published in 2016. So it's a little bit old as well. They haven't really collected a lot of new information about this since their research interests have progressed from here. But this is really at a time when online safety was a huge thing that was being talked about. So they wanted to know how parents kind of check what their teens are doing online. So, and you can kind of see from this graphic here how they're checking out their social media profiles or what websites they're doing. some parents even go through the phone calls or messages that their teens are giving out. There's parental controls, GPS monitoring, that kind of thing. And then having that communication about acceptable online behavior, right? What's appropriate to share online? How should you behave with your home and school online? What should you be viewing? That kind of thing. So all that kind of parental monitoring there with that. That kind of goes into another aspect of monitoring, which is called surveillance. And we'll be examining this a little bit more closely when we talk about how conflict theorists examine crime and deviance, which is next week. I'm super excited for you guys. And I'll be kind of posting a questionnaire about what you guys want to learn more about in crime and deviance for this week. So please make sure to fill that out with your comments and things like that, since I would love for you guys to do that, since I know a ton of you really like crime and deviance. So I'll hopefully make it a little bit fun there. But something that's called surveillance, so that aspect of classic Big Brother is always watching you, or the government is always watching you. Thinking about, for instance, this robot dog thing that they just implemented out over in the police stations in the Bronx, for instance, and they're kind of using that to start video surveilling people, and how it's being tried out and tested in a predominantly Black community in a poorer area of the Bronx, and how all the issues with that. Conflict theorists would be all over that. So we're going to be talking about some aspects of surveillance and crime in particular with this guy named Foucault when we talk about crime. But regarding media as well, this kind of surveillance of like, what exactly are you examining online? What are you interacting with online? What are you consuming? And that's just one thing to think about too. And then also in thinking about the conflict theory, this thing called dominant ideology is coming back to us. So remember from our culture chapter that dominant ideology is just basically something that's kind of the mainstream, so to speak. I hate using the word mainstream when we're talking about media, but something that like is kind of the most powerful instance of culture or just thinking. So this really helps us define what exactly is our reality. And thinking about those in power and things like that, conflict theorists are really concerned about thinking about who's in charge of either gatekeeping or just getting this information out. And one of the aspects of that is it's usually wealthy white males who are usually the decision makers, and what media is being put out there, whereas those who are in minority groups are usually ignored. So being very, very aware of this is something that is just one aspect that we need to be considering. And in thinking about this dominant ideology as well, the thing called stereotypes also comes back into. So again, stereotypes are just those unreliable generalizations that we can make about an entire group that doesn't necessarily recognize the individual differences that are occurring within that same group. So basically kind of overgeneralizing everything. And the ways that in media in particular can make these stereotypes stronger is because of the marketing techniques, as well as just the popularity in general of the media. And depending on how popular these media are, what really trends or something like that, these stereotypes can just be further and further cemented, which makes the groups that stereotypes are being placed upon or forced upon, causes them to really become devalued, right? So imagine if you yourself, and for some of you, you unfortunately have experiences like that depending on the types of media that you're thinking about. If one of your identities is stereotyped about on the media, and that's what people think about you, that causes you to really become devalued. And some people can't separate, what's on media, whatever type of media it is, and what's occurring in reality, right? Those two boundaries is blurred. So, and this can also lead to distortion, right? People think totally different things because of what media is selling them, even though reality is totally different. So kind of examining that. And these stereotypes, some progress is occurring in some areas, reducing these stereotypes, but not necessarily in all. So, and I've done quite a little bit of research with this, and I think it's absolutely fascinating to see how in different types of media this is progressing. But while there is progression, there's still some things that there are some problems that still need to be addressed. So, for instance, regarding queer theory hasn't popped up since I think week 1 or week 2 with research. So we're kind of popping back into that for just a second too, regarding how queer theory or just LGBTQ plus has been represented in the media. It's getting more and more visible as it's becoming more acceptable to talk about, and the members of the specific group are gaining more and more rights. However, in examining the media, for instance, there's always a lot of stereotypes about them. Think about, for instance, in Glee, while they have some gay or lesbian characters, sometimes they go right back to their storyline doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, and there's a stereotype about that. Another way that has been progressing is that visibility, right? Thinking about I see me in these different shows, right? That feeling of finally there's somebody who looks like me or has a similar identity to me, and is kind of visualizing in a more popular content-wise what I'm experiencing, and people can kind of see that. Or there are still some kind of boxes that some of these shows take into place. For instance, in Orange is the New Black, I was reading this one research that they did where they did a content analysis, so examining the script, but also the visuality of it, and seeing how the different types of lesbians that are on there's actually like 6 different types, which I thought was very fascinating. But you have your depending on the type of haircut that a character has and their actions, the more masculine female, or you have like the really, really girly female, but there's some actions there regarding it as well. So these stereotypes are still kind of in play, since sure, you can identify with those different types of personality arcs, but not everybody fits into those different boxes either. So that's one aspect of it. And then thinking about obesity, for instance, you always hear about the fat jokes and things like that. I think those are kind of reducing a little bit more now too, becoming more aware of that particular stereotype. And then kind of going back to being able to see people who you would identify with or who look like you, thinking about people of color and as well as their representation, and thinking about what their experiences are and how their experiences are valid and deserve to be heard. Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist, which is a newer show on one of their final episodes of the current season. They're kind of taking a mid-season break, but they're on season 2 right now. And one of the final ones was talking about Simon, who's the guy pictured here. He's the kind of like the marketing representative of this engineering company that kind of engineers different types of technology like watches and things like that. So very, very techy place. However, Simon, he's kind of one of the only Black guys that works at this company, and he talks about how walking into an elevator, he has to put on a certain demeanor so that way people aren't afraid of him because he's a Black guy, just because of the way that he looks. Or and just with the experience of the workplace, his manager, Zoe, who's the title character, she organizes a town hall to try to talk about race a little bit more in the workplace, but that town hall just kind of just goes down the crapshoot and doesn't really do much production wise. And so he starts singing this song, and the plot of Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist is a little bit weird, but he starts singing this song about he's a black man in a white world, which is a song that existed prior, but he does a cover of it. And it's very powerful since you kind of see the anguish that the other people of color are experiencing. And then kind of a spoiler for how the end of this mid-season kind of goes is that the experiences that Simon brings up and how he was almost forced to quit because he does bring up this discrimination that's occurring allows other people of color to have a voice and really try to change the narrative that, you know, this is my experience as being a person of color working at this place, and we should really bond together and really do something about it. So it's very quite powerful. And I strongly encourage you guys to watch Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist if you would like to. They bring up a lot of interesting aspects from, I'll probably bring up the show once again when we talk about gender roles, from being a female in the workplace and in a STEM program to being a black man in a white world. So lots of things that are going on there too, or even just identity. And there's this one character who struggles with the different types of faces that self-presentation, and where they feel like they aren't allowed to express their true self. So lots of good stuff happening there. That kind of just shows how media is changing and evolving and trying to demonstrate that, hey, these things are occurring and we really need to have a discussion about it. And dominant ideology can also be seen and mixed in with the culture, right? And your book mainly talks about this aspect of dominant ideology. But if you think about US media, it's very watched and imitated around the world, which is kind of interesting to think about, at least for me personally, about how like the shows that I'm watching are also seen throughout the world, or the ones that I don't necessarily like that are so full of American culture, such as The Simpsons, are just really watched around the world too. However, some popular shows that are really over here have actually also started in other countries. So Deal or No Deal, for instance, actually started out in the Netherlands. However, it's a huge thing over here. And then one of my favorite TV shows, Whose Line Is It Anyway, started out over in the UK and was brought over here, and there's been a lot of spin-offs since then. Absolutely like Drew Carey though, instead of the newer seasons, but anyway. So kind of just shows, thinking back to this aspect of globalization and how we're kind of connected via the media. This is also true thinking about TV networks and things like that. And there's also this type of media called hyperlocal media, which is just basically reporting on things that are local to your area. So say, for instance, if you live in Niles, any information that you're getting about your particular town, that would be considered hyperlocal media. You know, why did everybody go to this school for a socially distanced memorial the other day, or something like that? That would be considered hyperlocal media. And then, in addition to thinking about the inequalities that occur within media, via race or identity or something like that, there's also something called the digital divide. That's also an inequality that's occurring. And this has been widely talked about since the COVID has occurred. But what the digital divide is this gap regarding this, just the overall access to technology. Because those who are in developing countries, or those of a specific race or ethnic minority, or lower income groups, they don't necessarily have the means necessary to access technology, and technology in the broad word from, you know, newspapers or magazines to technology as we kind of see it. So and how do we kind of minimize this gap, right? So like I was saying with COVID in particular, with the access of internet because of education, as we've all moved to an online format in some way, shape, or form, there was a lot of concern about, well, how are those lower income students going to be even able to access online classes? And there was this kind of big rally about how school buses would have like Wi-Fi available, so they would just park it outside of different apartment complexes and things like that. Or different internet companies would lower the bill that you would primarily pay to make internet more affordable. However, even though we're still in the pandemic, it's still kind of rising back up. So, but there's a digital divide that's occurring there, limiting that access to information, which shouldn't occur. And then there's also thinking about for your business and examining, say, if you're an entrepreneur and things like that, if you necessarily can't access the internet, you're missing out on either reviews of your business or having a website about your business and selling your products online, or just offering additional information or the backstory, or perhaps if you have a restaurant, a menu, so that way you can get more orders. So if you don't have that access of information, you're really missing out on some potential customers or profits and things like that. And then I'm thinking about it from a medical standpoint as well. If you don't have access to an internet, you don't have information regarding potentially different medical resources in your area, or even if medical offices didn't have access to technology. Nowadays, they can kind of just ask you a survey about your symptoms and things like that, and then it'll pop up with some suggestions that the doctor can kind of go through depending on your medical history, which is absolutely amazing what the advancement in medical technology is doing. However, if perhaps it's a poor area, or depending on different circumstances, if you don't have that, you might be missing out on the best care they could possibly have, and waste time or even your money as well. So kind of examining those aspects of the digital divide there too. So there's a lot of areas where this is occurring, not just in education. So we're going to end it there, and in the next video we'll examine feminism a little bit, and feminist theory, and then probably the one after that is going to conclude our series with interactionist theory. However, we've seen in this video how conflict theorists see how media divides us, thinking about that dominant ideology and that culture, and how stereotypes are still evident, but still we're having conversations about it. And then also there's this thing called the digital divide. But that's it for now, and I'll see you in the next video.